and our host is Frank Schroeder.
Good evening, and thanks for joining us. We have a very interesting program for you tonight. We're going to be looking at constitutional issues, most specifically the First Amendment of the Bill of Rights. Joining me as the guests for tonight's program are Marvin Zevin and Frank Russo. Both Marvin and Frank have great respect for the First Amendment. However, they have very different views as to its real meaning. We're going to be discussing that with you tonight. Marvin Zevin is an attorney affiliated with the Nassau chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union. Marvin has been a guest on 2 earlier programs in the American Family Association series. Frank Russo, a retired former division manager with AT&T and the New York Telephone Company, is the New York State Director of the American Family Association. Also joining me in the questioning is Barbara Bernstein, Executive Director of the Nassau chapter of the New York Civil Liberties Union. Welcome.
Good to be here.
My first question has to do with, of course, what is still very much on everybody's mind lately is the September 11th terrorist attacks. And, of course, September 11th, we were attacked by foreign terrorists. And as a result, there is considerable interest in the use, the possible use of national identification cards. Some oppose this as an unwarranted invasion of privacy, while others support it as being necessary to combat terrorism. So I want to find out what each of you think about this. And why don't we start with you, Marvin?
Happy to try to answer it. And I think there are 2 answers to it, one philosophic and the other a very practical issue. Let me start with the philosophic one to begin with. This country was born by people who were willing to give up life, liberty, and wealth, or debt, life itself, in an attempt to violently overthrow the government of the king at that time. They succeeded. But philosophically, they wanted to create a nation that was free to think, free to pray anywhere they wanted, free to do anything they wanted as long as it was legal, and free to go anywhere they wanted to. And that's what's made this nation great. You know, the pioneers who went across the country in wagon trains didn't ask for a troop of federal cavalry to escort them. Right. They were courageous people. They were willing to take the chances and the risks, and they built this nation, and it's the greatest nation. And you have to think of what Benjamin Franklin said early on. He said, with time, we would be willing to give up a little bit of freedom to get a little bit more security. And I asked my friends, and most of them say, sure, they'd give up a little freedom for a little security. Mm-hmm. And so you look at history, because they've forgotten history. They've forgotten Adolf Hitler, who came to power in order to give the German people law and order.
And with respect to the national ID cards, this would...
Oh, in Germany, you had to produce your papers. Mm-hmm. If you walked down the street and a policeman came up to you and said, produce your papers, you had to produce it.
So you're concerned that we would turn into a Nazi-type state if we had people ask for, if people had to have national ID cards?
You know, you're taking me to the extreme to begin with.
Oh, no, you brought it up. That's the reason.
Yes. I was going to go to the Soviet Union next, where you couldn't go from town to town without getting permission from the police. You can go to every second and third-rate dictatorship that our State Department supported because they said they were not communists and therefore it was okay.
But I just want to stay on the issue of national ID cards in the United States.
Right. I know, but you're going to say the government will never get there. So let me talk about the United States government then. Okay. Were we so benignly kind to the American Indian? Mm-hmm. No, we could kill. Were we so kind to Japanese Americans? No, we could round them all up. So our government is not above doing what other governments do. Okay. And that is a great fear. Sure, you give up a little freedom to get a little security, and then the government wants to go all the way, like they want to have secret military tribunals, such as were held in Afghanistan, which we objected to, such as are held in China that we objected to. In other words, whenever it's done somewhere else, we object to it, but
Marvin,
we do it.
Do you oppose national ID cards?
Yes, now we get to the very practical answer. They're useless.
Okay.
any of the terrorists, not all any, I think most of the Saudi terrorists who were involved would be eligible for a national ID card.
Okay, so you oppose it. I just want to get Frank's view. My
I'm
only
sorry.
point is that the wagon trains and the pilgrims, that we didn't have jet airliners crashing into the World Trade Center. Frank,
No,
you-
but wait a minute, but we did have Indians attacking the wagon trains. And we didn't ask for federal cavalry to go out there with every wagon train like we're doing now.
why do you think,
Yeah,
what is your view on
well,
national
when I
ID
was
cards?
young, and the Young Americans for Freedom was a conservative group, I leaned against such a thing as a national ID, the concept of a national ID card. The concern being at that time that there was some probability that Marxism, Soviet Union, would use that to our disadvantage, would somehow take over our country and have all sorts of information about each citizen, and would really subject us to a totalitarian police state. There was some, and I even have to admit it was a remote possibility. Today, I just think that's practically non-existent, and just to see what's happened with these terrorists, that our country is, and again, part of me doesn't like the idea that you have to carry this, and I certainly would never want to permit policemen to willy-nilly stop you and ask you for your ID card with no basis. But considering the extent of the terrorism and that our country is so free and that we have so many millions, we know, millions of illegal immigrants, in addition to so many millions of legal immigrants, it is such a problem. The complexities, the bureaucracy now in getting on an airplane. How do we check people? I've now come to the conclusion I would favor a national ID card. And again, I'm still open to criticisms and listen to the other point of view, but my leanings would be to favor one that would have your picture, would have your fingerprint, would have perhaps your social security number, your date of birth, just like a driver. You have a driver's license. It would be like a driver's license, except it would be something that would be nationwide rather than statewide.
What would it do?
It would facilitate police identifying who's who, who's a citizen, who's not a citizen. To be honest, I think all 19 of the terrorists were not citizens. That's my understanding. I believe they were all non-citizens. They were legal, mostly legal immigrants, perhaps a few illegal immigrants, and that their visas may have expired and so forth, but they were not citizens. And it would just facilitate identification of people. In addition, I see another advantage. Minor thing maybe, but I know in our school district, when we have our votes, we don't know who's voting. We've had one gentleman to test the system. He registered as Mickey Mouse, and he was registered. He didn't vote, but he passed the registration as Mickey Mouse because they don't ask for any ID. You don't have any proof. I don't even know if they're allowed to ask for proof. I think we're at a point now where, unless someone challenges a voter, and people don't want to go challenging people they don't know without some basis, I think we should be able to ask when people go to vote, you should be able to be asked for some kind of an ID card, so you can prove who you are.
But with respect to national security,
It would be national security
you
and
feel that these are extraordinary times, and therefore
incredible times. Do you know how simple it would be today for someone to take 3 or 4 cars, especially with people who don't care about committing suicide? To me, the plane thing was complicated, relatively speaking. But to take 3 or 4 cars, go on the George Washington Bridge, the Verrazano Bridge, the Midtown Tunnel, stop the cars in the middle of the tunnel or at some strategic point, and with dynamite loaded, boom.
Barbara,
Now,
why don't you jump in here?
Yeah, because each time you make a statement, I have a question that I want to ask in response. So I've got about 20 questions I want to ask.
We have a lot of issues that go ahead, just with respect to the national ID card.
First of all, I want to get back to the guy on the bridge blowing it up, because I thought of that too when this first happened. But you said you certainly wouldn't want an ID card if people were going to be stopped willy-nilly. How are you going to stop the police officer from stopping anybody that he says looks suspicious? And that is going to get to what we've all dreaded, is racial profiling. You say citizen, non-citizen. There are 20 million non-citizens in this country. 20 million. And I would guarantee you that 99 and 99.9% of them are not dangerous to this country. But you're going to stop them? And what happens if you don't have your ID card on?
I mean, I could even see, Barbara, with the technology that we have, you may be asked to take this ID card and shove it into some kind of a machine as you enter the bridge. And if you're not a citizen, maybe you go a certain different path. I mean, these are possibilities. We don't know what's going to happen. If there are no bridges and tunnels blown up in the next 5 or 10 years, then I think that the need is reduced.
The problem is that when you have people who are willing to die to promote their cause, an ID card is totally useless. Because because 15 out of the 19 hijackers had licenses and credit cards and internet accounts They could have gotten a national ID card.
But do you think that would change now?
Timothy McVeigh.
No, but at least you
could have
know who's
gotten-
a citizen and who's not.
But who
See,
ca-
would
but
you
this-
agree, let me ask you, would you agree that the more significant danger is from non-citizens than from citizens? Would you agree with that?
Well,
Timothy McVeigh was a citizen.
He
I
was
know,
a citizen,
I know
and he
would.
could
But
have
I'm just
got a
saying,
national-
in
Once-
general, I'm more,
once
much more
you
worried.
have-
Let me ask you, are you more worried about Timothy McVeigh's in the future or about some foreign terrorists?
Timothy McVeigh.
And I'm more worried about the foreign terrorists.
Timothy McVeigh.
That's a
because
difference
there's a
between
bunch
us
of them
then.
out there in Idaho or wherever they
I don't
are.
think there are too many. I think he's
Well,
a
okay.
unique and bizarre
I'm
individual.
going to give Marvin the last word on this issue.
May I just give an example of profiling, if you like?
Yeah.
I have a law partner named Frank Yanelli who was clean-shaven, and I have a beard. We once went to the federal court. He was permitted through, I was patted down and frisked on the basis of my beard. I was wearing a suit, a tie, dressed as he was, but the beard was the profile. Now, the Taliban's, of course, in the United States cut off their beards, so they would not be picked up at all. I just don't know how you enforce it. But, you know, you talk about technology. Let me tell you the technology that will evolve within your lifetime, at least. A chip, which can be inserted in any human being, which can emit a signal, which will go to a channel, a microwave set, which will go to a satellite, which will beam down to Washington, so the government will know where any individual is at any time doing anything. Now, the congressmen and the senators would object to it because, you know, Condit wouldn't want people to know that. But the government would have the ability to know where everybody is at any given instant. Is that the kind of...
We don't want it, but you know, with
That's where
what's
we're gonna
going
go.
on, no, the risks are so serious. The risks are so serious nowadays. I think we have to take extra steps, and to be able to distinguish at least between citizens and non-citizens. And I disagree with you. I think that the far more dangerous risk is from foreigners, people who are not citizens, and who will come from certain parts of the world, who have a certain ideology, a certain faith.
But how are you going to find them with an ID card? Most of the non-citizens here
Right.
are people who have overstayed their visas, who were here as students, who came to visit relatives, who were here as laborers from Central or South America. You're going to be stopping people willy-nilly, and if they don't have an ID card, are you going to arrest them? What is going to happen
I
if you
would
don't?
require people to have an ID
And
card.
if they don't have it or it was stolen,
If
are
they
you
have
going
it,
to
you'd have
arrest them?
An individual. If you don't have a driver's license, what happens? You have to have a driver's license when you're driving a car.
We're going to get out simply because, believe it or not, we're already at the halfway point of our
Oh, my
show,
goodness.
and we've only handled one question. You've
Okay.
tuned into the American Family Association Presents. We have Marvin Zevin and Frank Russo and Barbara Bernstein discussing the First Amendment. We're now going to go to a public service announcement. Stay with us. We'll be back in 60 seconds.
That's all over. That wasn't too bad now, was it?
We're back here. Thanks for staying tuned. We're talking about the First Amendment with Frank Russo and Marvin Zevin. Speaking about the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law regarding the establishment of religion nor prohibit the free exercise thereof. When students recite the Pledge of Allegiance, they say the words, "One nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all." Do you think that this practice, which is common in our public schools of saying the Pledge of Allegiance with the words "under God," violates the Constitution? Why don't I throw that to you first, Marvin?
Of course. but it's also one of those meaningless things that children do, and they get up and they say these words and they hardly ever know what they mean. But is it unconstitutional? Yes.
Would you
The
say
government-
that it should be eradicated from, you say it's meaningless when students say it, but to require students to say it at school, you would say that that violates the Constitution?
Sure. Some people say there is a God, some people say there is no God. Some people say they don't know if there's a God. So why should children be subjected to the absolute certainty of an established God by a society that is diverse?
How about
doesn't
pledging
know?
allegiance to the flag? Should that be eradicated?
No, I'm not talking about that. I'm
Okay.
talking the words under God.
So it's just the under God portion of the Pledge of Allegiance that causes constitutional concerns?
Yes.
Okay.
And-
Frank?
Well, first of all, no student is required to say the Pledge of Allegiance. That's just to clarify that. That's my understanding of the law is no student is required. Most public schools do have it as a custom, and I very much support it. I think the words "One Nation under God" reflect a long-term. It's really acknowledging and recognizing a long-term pattern of belief in this country by our founding fathers, by our citizenry, for 18th, 19th, 20th, now into the 21st century. So it's simply a recognition of that. I think it's very, very wholesome, a very good practice. So I support it, and I believe it's constitutional because it's not establishing any single religion.
Bill Clinton said that our public schools should not be religious-free zones. Would you have them be religious-free zones?
Yes, I think public schools are there to teach us to read, to write, to think, to analyze.
But religion is not part of analyzing or thinking or being part of the world?
Well, if you're going to permit that, I mean, there are courses in religion, as long as you also point out that there are some people who don't know there's a God, there's some people who are atheists, and there is no. You can make this leap of faith if you want to, but you don't have to. You can be free to think as you wish, and you should not really be forced to say, yes, there is a God. Nobody knows if there's a God.
And nobody, assuming that nobody's forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance, but it's said, do you still have a problem with it, the mere fact that it's said on public property?
Sure, you've got a problem. You say, what child is going to have the courage to stand up, or not to say the Pledge of Allegiance, to walk out of the room?
In today's day and age, they'd
Most
work out
of
for
them,
anything.
come on, some 6-year-old's going to do it, 8-year-old, and as all religions well known, if you get the kids young enough, you can indoctrinate them young enough, and then it's hard to overcome. But the education system does, by the way, when these kids get into college, or the ones who go to college, soon have diverse opinions.
Barbara?
Mr. Russo, do you think that the pledge should be compulsory?
No, I would never. I would not want the pledge to be compulsory, but I support the schools, encouraging the students to say it, making it available to be said, and so forth, but never requiring a student to say it. I listened to Marvin's point about, and I understand what he's saying about it, the pressure on a 10 or 12-year-old student or 13-year-old standing up and not saying it. Peers are going to put pressure, and I sympathize with that. But on the other hand, do you sympathize with my concern when the public schools hand out condoms in class and talk about oral sex in class? I find that very offensive. And believe it or not, the policy in New York State is there is no opt-out policy. Each school district can force a student to sit in and listen to this.
And I suppose the reason is because we have a terrific public health concern.
No, AIDS is different. In AIDS, there's 2 sets of regulations, if
Yeah.
you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
The state education department, AIDS regulations and health. On AIDS, there are 3 parts. What causes AIDS and so forth. And the part about preventing AIDS, you can opt out on. AIDS, I have no problem with how the law is structured on AIDS. On the rest of the health ed curriculum, where they talk about oral sex and homosexuality and all of this kind of bestiality, whatever they want to talk about, a school district can require students to take this
think
material,
that the
and you don't have a sympathy for the kid who's going to feel embarrassed if he tries to opt out, in which case it's a fight for the right to opt out.
Well, I think that the problems have arisen where there has been no sex education. Parents don't generally talk to their children about sex. Kids learn on the street, and I think what the school system is trying to do is to have some kind of formal education about sex so that they don't end up pregnant when they don't want to be, and therefore having abortions that you oppose. This is all geared to preventing
See, the
pregnancies.
studies that I've seen, Barbara, show 3 things. They've looked at 3 situations: compulsory sex ed, no sex or abstinence education. When you compare the compulsory sex ed with no sex ed, the no sex ed kids engage in sex less frequently than the kids who have compulsory sex ed. The best of all is when it's better than no sex ed is when it's abstinence only sex ed. Those kids postpone sexual activity the longest and have the least
You
rate
and
of
I are
sexual
reading
activity.
different statistical studies.
Let's go back to the First Amendment. And again, this has to do with freedom of school choice. It's been termed educational vouchers and a concern of separation of church and state. Should all parents, rich and poor alike, have the basic right to select their child's school and receive their fair share of the educational tax dollar, or should they be forced to pick the government school in order to receive aid?
That's a wonderful spin on the issue.
Why don't you put your spin on it?
Fine. The issue is we have a public school system in the United States. We pay taxes for it. All children have access to that public school education. It should be the best possible education
So we
can
pay
give them.
taxes. They take educational tax dollars and they say it only goes to the government school. They shouldn't say you're required to go to school. It's compulsory to send your kid to school, but take the money that's required to spend at school and spend it in any school you want. That shouldn't be allowed.
No. We have, you're talking about 200 years of American history in a public school system that was established 100 years ago. It has given us some of the best educated people in the entire world, some of the worst educated ones too, but as a generalization, we have a good education system. And it is good because everybody gets together with tax dollars, spends the most they can on a child to educate it.
Why, as soon as they're given a choice to go to school, do they run to the private schools, if the public schools are so good?
Some do, some don't. But I suspect they go to the private schools, if you like, because they think they will get a better education in the private schools because they haven't been willing to give the public schools sufficient money. Now, let's talk about dollars for the moment. I pay in school taxes out here in the neighborhood of $8,000. For a comparable residence in the city of New York, you would pay about $1,600. Now, if the people of the city of New York are not willing to pay money for taxation, well, they're going to get a worse educational system. But it's a question of how much money are you willing to spend.
So you think the educational system, the public school educational system, is a lack of money? Frank?
Yeah, I really am shocked at the position of the Civil Liberties Union on this issue of school choice. Just because for 100 years people have all gone in one direction, you want to insist on that being the direction for everyone and mandating it for everyone in effect, unless you're very wealthy. I mean, Christianity was the dominant religion in this country, and yet you would say that doesn't necessitate or justify trying to impose Christianity on the rest of this country, and I agree with you. Why not permit? You said something before, Marvin, I completely agree with. You said the purpose of education in every state, in the state of New York, is math, English, history, science, and possibly health ed, music, and art. I completely agree. The question then is, why should not the parent, if I as a parent feel that prayer is appropriate, that a prayer at the beginning of the day...
Why should I pay for
Well, hold
your
on.
prayer?
Suppose, I don't want you to pay, but suppose I believe prayer at the beginning of the day and end of the day is appropriate. Grace before and after meals is appropriate. I don't want to impose that on you, but I don't think you should impose your secular humanist views on me. So why not let the parent pick whatever school they want and get a fair share of the educational tax money? You get your $10,000, I get my $10,000. You pick the government school or whatever school you want. Let me pick the school I want. You can have no prayer. You could eliminate the Pledge of Allegiance if you want. No God Bless America. Let me do what I want as long as my school meets the state requirement on math, English, history, and science. Add music and art if you'd like. And I don't want any extra money for religion, but if I'm putting my money in for educational purposes, I don't see why I shouldn't be entitled to my fair
Why
share of
should
it.
your child not be able to say grace before meals in a public school? Say any religious prayer that your child wants to say.
I want it led by the
And-
teachers. I want it, and I want a crucifix on the wall.
Fine, then why should I pay for your
I don't want you
crucifix? 90%
I'll
of the
pay for the
school-
crucifix.
No, if my public taxes have to go to your parochial
Only to teach
school,
math, English, history, and science.
that's impossible. If
That's
there's
I'm paying for the teacher and for
No,
whatever the
no,
cost of the bill.
no.
If I want to
90%
add religion, I'll pay for it.
No, but your religious school teaches religion as well as math, English, and science.
Yes.
90%
And your
of
school
the
does
schools-
too. Your public schools are teaching secular humanism.
They're not teaching secular humanism.
Sure,
Math,
certainly
English,
they
and
are.
Well, if you call math,
No,
English,
absence
and
of
science
God.
secular.
Secular humanists
don't
are
teach absence
opposed
of
to any
God.
religion in schools. So you're getting your way in the public schools. The public schools are teaching secular humanism.
The public school is a neutral, non-religious setting. If you want to teach your child religion, you teach your child religion at home and in your religious,
Barbara,
in the
look,
church
if
and in
we each
your
pay
religious
money.
schools.
We each pay money for education.
Yeah.
Why do you want to deny parents the right to pick a religious school?
Because I don't want to pay for it.
I don't want you to pay for it. I want you to pay for your own kids' education.
Folks, we're down to the last 2 minutes. I'm going to jam one more question in here, having to do again with the separation of church and state. During the recent election that we saw several violations of constitutional law and IRS regulations. New Jersey candidate for governor James McGreevey won the endorsement of the Black Ministers Council of New Jersey. Mark Green campaigned in a string of black churches. Over that weekend, Jim McGreevey was at a fundraiser at a black church. Not one newspaper picked up on that. There was not a word from the ACLU, but the latter group did complain that Catholic bishops in New Jersey who urged voters to consider human life issues when they vote, that should be considered. So what's going on here, Marvin? Why is there no standard for black churches but a double standard for churches, for Catholic churches?
Unfortunately, many years ago, it was decided to give religious institutions tax exemption. And you're right. If they get tax exemption, they should not participate in politics. The solution is very simple.
But why didn't the ACLU speak up when they did? Mark Green stood in a pulpit in a Protestant church.
I'm speaking.
Okay.
The solution is very simple. Put every piece of property owned by anybody, including church institutions, on the tax rolls. Every citizen will benefit, every homeowner will benefit, and there's no reason that religious institutions should not pay taxes. Then they can get into any political situations they want to. And let me say, I ran for election.
45 seconds. I just want to let Frank weigh in
I
on
would
this.
totally oppose that. I favor the exemption for religious institutions, churches, synagogues, temples. But I think that any church that invites a politician in to give a political talk during a campaign should lose their tax exemption. The Catholic churches studiously avoid that, but there are many churches that adopt the Democratic platform. They allow the liberal Democrats into their churches, and the ACLU says not a word about it.
15 seconds. Last word, Barbara.
Mark Green or anybody else can go to a Catholic church, a black church, anything else, and ask for votes the way he can go to a labor union, the way he can go to any kind of group and ask for votes.
But why does a bishop get criticized when he speaks out about the
They're not allowed to do it in the church.
He's not getting criticized.
Barbara,
He
they're
sure
not
is.
allowed to do that in a church.
What?
We're out of time, folks. We obviously need an hour, not a half hour on this program. Thank you to our guests, Marvin
week.
Zevin, Frank Russo, and Barbara Bernstein. Good discussion.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us.
When's Daddy coming home? Soon.
Other news, negotiations broke down again.
Daddy, Daddy! Jared! Jared, wait! Come on.
You got me.
So how was work?
Brutal. One meeting after another. I got a ton to do tonight.
At the end of the day, when the weight of the world is upon you,
Daddy doesn't want to play. Hey!
isn't it amazing
All right.
how the weight of their love can lift you up again?
Hey, you guys coming to dinner? Hey, guys.
For a free brochure about rediscovering the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY.
When the pressures of the day are over and the last obligation has been met, there comes a time to celebrate the greatest gifts of all. To rediscover the joy of your children, call 1-800-A-FAMILY.
His free quarterly newsletter. Just call or write us with your name and address. You may contact the AFA by writing us at P.O. Box 203, Port Washington, New York 11050, or calling us at 516-944-3544. You can also read our newsletter and see our TV schedule by visiting our website at afany.org. Your comments are welcome, and thanks for being with us.